Hi everyone, in this video we will be going over A-Level Accounting 2022 October-November paper 2-3 question number 4. This is the structured paper 2 which consists of 4 questions. 2 of them are of 30 marks and 2 of them are of 15 marks, and we're also given a time limit of 1 hour and 30 minutes. And since question number 4 is of 30 marks, ideally we should be spending about 30 minutes in order to complete this question. And in this video as well, we will be attempting to solve this question under 30 minutes. So without any further delay, let's get started. X Limited is a manufacturing business operating 2 production departments, machining and finishing, and 2 service departments, stores and maintenance. All overhead costs have already been allocated to the departments. The service department costs are to be apportioned to production departments as follows. So now we just need to reallocate the cost of service departments, which are the stores and maintenance, towards our production departments, which are machining and finishing, on the following basis. So for stores department, we are to reallocate its overhead to the 3 remaining departments, machining, finishing and maintenance, in proportion to the number of parts orders. So let's have a look at the number of parts orders, which is right here. Alright, let's figure out the total. That's 6,400 for machining department, 1,800 for finishing department, and 300 for maintenance department, which makes the total to be 8,500. Okay, and then the maintenance department's overhead is to be reallocated in proportion to the number of maintenance callouts. And the number of maintenance callouts is given right here, which is 120 for machining department and 30 for finishing department, which makes the total to be 150. Okay, let's have a look at our first question. We need to complete the table to apportion the service department costs to production departments. We already have the allocated overheads, indirect labor, other indirect costs, and the total overheads as well. Firstly, we will be reapportioning the store's overheads towards the remaining 3 departments, machining, finishing and maintenance. So let's have a look at our basis above. Out of the total overhead of our stores department, 6,400 by 8,500 will go towards our machining department, right? So let's figure out its value. For machining department, that's going to be the total overheads of 148,000, and only 6,400 out of 8,500 goes towards this department. So this gives the reapportioned amount towards our machining department to be 111,435.29. So let's round it off. That's going to be 111,435 in our machining department. And we are talking about reapportioning the stores, so let's write it down. This is reapportionment of stores, and for machining that is going to be 111,435. Similarly, let's figure out the value for finishing department. Let's have a look above. That is 1,800 out of the total of 8,500 towards our finishing department. So that is just going to be the total overhead of stores department, which is 148,000 times 1,800 out of the total of 8,500. And this gives the reapportionment towards finishing department to have the value of 31,341.18. Again, let's round it off. That's going to be 31,341 towards our finishing department. Let's write it down. Now the last one is maintenance, and we have the basis 300 out of 8,500 towards our maintenance department. Let's figure it out. That will be the total amount of overheads for stores, that's 148,000 times 300 out of 8,500. This gives the reapportionment towards maintenance department to have the value of 5,223.53. Let's round it off. That is going to be 5,224 towards our maintenance department. Alright, and since we are reallocating this amount to the remaining 3 departments, this just means that we are taking this amount of 148,000 from the stores and just redistributing it towards our remaining departments. And after redistribution, the total amount in the stores is going to be 0. So we just need to subtract this exact amount from the stores department so that we get the total to be 0 for this department. That's 148,000, but in a bracket. Okay, now let's figure out the subtotals. The subtotals for all of the departments is just going to be the sum of total overheads and the reapportionment of stores. which means that for machining, that is going to be 508,500 plus 111,435, which results in 619,935. For finishing, that will be 623,400 plus 31,341, which results in 654,741. For stores, that is just going to be 148,000 minus 148,000, which results in 0. Then for maintenance, that is just going to be 343,000 plus 5,224, which results in 348,224. Now the next step would be to reapportion this total overhead of the maintenance departments towards our two production departments, machining and finishing. Let's write down our heading. This is going to be reapportionment of maintenance. And let's have a look at our basis. For maintenance, that's 120 out of 150 for machining department and 30 out of 150 for finishing department. So let's figure it out. For our machining department, we start with the total of our maintenance department, which is 348,224, and 120 out of 150 belongs to maintenance department. So this gives the reapportionment of maintenance towards our machining department to have the amount of 278,579.2. We can just round it off, so that will be 278,579. Now let's repeat the same process for finishing department. We again start with the total 348,224, and 30 out of 150 belongs to finishing department. So that's times 30 by 150, which results in the amount of 69,644.8. Again, let's round it off. So that's going to be 69,645. Let's write it down. For our machining department, that's 278,579. For finishing, that will be 69,645. And again, like we did before for stores, we are just reapportioning this amount towards the remaining two production departments, right? Which just means that we are taking this amount and redistributing it, which means that the total now for the maintenance department is going to be 0. And in order for this to be 0, we just need to subtract this exact amount. So that's going to be 348,224, but in a bracket. Now let's figure out our total overheads. The total overheads is just going to be the sum of our subtotals and reapportionment of maintenance. For machining department, that is going to be 619,935 plus 278,579, which results in 898,514. For finishing department, that is going to be 654,741 plus 69,645, which results in 724,386. And for our maintenance department, that is going to be 348,224 minus 348,224, which results in 0. This concludes the first part of this question. We can now move towards the second one. We now need to calculate to 2 decimal places a suitable overhead absorption rate for each production department. Alright, so we need to calculate the overhead absorption rate for machining department as well as the finishing department. And we already have our overheads, or the total overheads, right? So we just need to figure out our overhead absorption rate. So first of all, we need to take a look at our machine hours and labor hours for both the production departments, machining and finishing. So let's have a look above. Right here, we can see that we are given the direct labor hours and the machine hours for both the department, machining and finishing. Now let's compare the direct labor hours and machine hours of machining department. We can see that the direct labor hours is 11,500, whereas the machine hours is 48,000. Clearly, the machine hour is the higher one, which means that for machining department, we need to base our overhead absorption rate on the machine hours. Let's do the same process for finishing department. We can see that the direct labor hours is 54,600, whereas the machine hours is 12,000. Clearly, the direct labor hour is the higher one, which means that the overhead absorption rate for finishing department will be based on our direct labor hours. Now, what this base means is that we need to divide the total overheads for machining department by our machine hours, whereas for finishing department, we need to divide the total overheads by our direct labor hours. So let's do that. The machine hours for machining department is 48,000 and the direct labor hours for finishing department is 54,600. Let's keep that information in mind. Now for machining department, we have the total overheads to be 898,514. Let's write that down. That's 898,514. And we already decided that for our machining department, the basis would be our machine hours, which was 48,000. So we just need to divide our total overhead by that number of 48,000. This gives the overhead absorption rate for machining department to be 18.72. And remember that the basis was our machine hour, right? So we need to include that as well. This is per machine hour. Now let's have a look at our total overhead for finishing department. We figured it out to be 724,386. Let's write this amount down. That is 724,386. All right, and we already figured out that the basis for overhead absorption rate for finishing department would be the direct labor hours, right? And the total direct labor hours given for the finishing department was 54,600, which gives the overhead absorption rate to be 13.27. And this is based on the direct labor hour, right? So this is per labor hour. This concludes the second part. We can move towards the third one now. We are given additional information. The actual results for the year ended 30 September 2022 were as follows. We are given the total overheads for both the machining as well as finishing department, and we are given the direct labor hours as well as machine hours for both the departments. Now we just need to calculate the overabsorption or underabsorption of overheads for each production department. We are already given the actual total overheads, so let's figure out the budgeted total overheads for machining and finishing department. So this is budgeted total overheads. Now for machining department and finishing department. All right, we already have our overhead absorption rate for both these departments, right? Let's write that down. That is 18.72 per machine hour for machining and 13.27 per labor hour for finishing. So that will be 18.72 and 13.27. And remember that for machining, it is based on the total machine hours, and the total actual machine hours was 49,200. So we're just going to multiply it by that amount or number. And we're multiplying with this actual machine hours because we need to compare and figure out whether there was an overabsorption or underabsorption. And in order to do so, we need to have the same basis or the same number of machine hours for both the actual as well as the budgeted total overheads, right? That is why we are multiplying with this number. So this gives our budgeted total overhead for machining department to have the amount of 921,024. Now let's repeat the same process for finishing department. We know that this is the overhead absorption rate based on the labor hours, and the actual total labor hours is given to be 51,800. Let's multiply that. Now this gives the total budgeted overheads for finishing department to have the amount of 687,386. Now we just need to compare it with our total actual overheads. Let's write it down. So that's actual total overheads, and it is given right here. For machining, that's 910,000. For finishing, that is 705,000. Now let's figure out the over or under absorption. And remember the criteria for our overabsorption and underabsorption. Overabsorption takes place when our budgeted total overheads is greater than the actual overheads, whereas underabsorption takes place when our budgeted total overheads is less than the actual total overheads. And in case of machining department, we can see that the budgeted total overheads is greater than the actual total overheads, which means that there is going to be overabsorption, right? So let's figure out the amount of over absorption. That is just going to be the difference between these two amounts. So that's 921,024 minus 910,000, which results in the amount of 11,024, and this is over absorbed. Now for finishing department, we can see that the budgeted total overheads is less than the actual total overheads, right? Which means that this is the condition for under absorption. Let's figure out the value for under absorption. Again, that is the difference between these two amounts. So that's 705,000 minus 687,386, which results in the amount of 17,614. And this is under absorbed. This concludes the third part. We can now move towards the fourth one. We need to state two possible reasons why a business may under-absorb overheads. Now, the very first reason was that budgeted total overheads is less than the actual total overheads, which means that the actual expenditure is higher than budgeted expenditure. Let's write it down. Actual expenditure was higher than the budgeted expenditure. And the second reason could be that the actual output was less than the budgeted output. So actual output was less than budgeted output. This concludes the fourth part. We can now move towards the fifth one. We are given additional information. The total budgeted direct labor cost for the production departments for the year ended 30 September 2022 was 594,900. We now need to calculate the budgeted hourly direct labor rate for the production departments. Since we need to calculate the budgeted hourly direct labor rate, we just need to divide this total budgeted direct labor cost by our budgeted direct labor hours, right, for the production department. So let's have a look above. We can see that the budgeted direct labor hours is given right here. For machining department, that's 11,500. For finishing departments, that's 54,600. So let's figure out the total. That's 11,500 plus 54,600, which results in our total direct labor hours for the production department to be 66,100. So we're just going to use this number. Let's figure it out. That is going to be the total budgeted direct labor cost of 594,900, which is given above, divided by the total budgeted direct labor hours, which was 66,100. And this gives our budgeted hourly direct labor rate to be 9 per labor hour. Alright, this concludes the fifth part. We can now move towards the sixth one. We're given additional information. X Limited have been asked to supply a quotation for a customer who requires 50 units of a product. Each unit would require the following. Alright, the direct material is 4 kilos at 2.45 per kilo. Then we're given the direct labor for machining departments, that's 3 hours, and for finishing departments, that's 4.5 hours. We're given the overheads for machining department as well as finishing department. Then we're also told that the machining department is working at full capacity, so an overtime premium of 25% would be required to complete this work. And we are also told that X Limited would require a profit margin of 25% on his work. Alright, now what we need to prepare is a statement to show the total selling price that X Limited will quote to a customer. Alright, in order to figure out the total selling price, first of all, let's figure out the total cost, right? And in order to figure out the total cost, we first require the cost per unit. So let's figure out the cost per unit. We will start our statement with all of our costs, and the very first one is the direct material. Let's have a look above. We are told that the direct material required is 4 kilos at 2.45 per kilo, and this is per each unit, right? So the total direct material per unit is just going to be the product of these two amounts. Let's figure it out. That is going to be 4 times 2.45, which results in the direct material per unit to be 9.80. The next step would be our direct labor. And we have two departments. So that is going to be for machining department and finishing department. Let's have a look above. We can see that for machining department, it requires 3 hours. And we are also given additional information that the machining department is working at full capacity, so an overtime premium of 25% would be required. And our normal rate, we already figured it out to be 9 per labor hour, right? And we need to provide an overtime premium of 25%. So that is just going to be 9 times the usual rate plus an overtime premium of 25%, which we can write down as 0.25. So that is just going to be 9 times 1.25, which results in 11.25. So this is the amount per hour required for machining department. So let's write it down. The number of hours is 3 and the amount is 11.25, which results in the direct labor hour per unit to have the value of 33.75. Now for finishing department, we have the total number of hours to be 4.5 and our rate is 9. So that is just going to be 4.5 times $9, which results in our direct labor for finishing department per unit to be 40.50. Now we need to include our overheads for machining as well as finishing. Okay, and we can see that these overheads are to be allocated on the basis of our overhead absorption rate that we calculated before, right? So let's have a look there. Our overhead absorption rate for machining was 18.72 per machine hour. So let's calculate it. The machine hour for machining department is 1.25. So we're just going to multiply this number of hour with that rate. So that's 1.25 times the overhead absorption rate of 18.72. This gives a per unit overhead for machining department to have the value of 23.40. Now we repeat the same process for finishing department. Let's have a look above. The overhead absorption rate was 13.27 per labor hour. Let's have a look at our labor hour for finishing department. That was 2.5. So the overhead is just going to be 2.5 times the rate, which was 13.27, which results in the per unit overhead for finishing department to be 33.18. This concludes all of our cost. So let's figure out the total cost per unit. That is just going to be the sum of these 5 amounts, which is 9.80 plus 33.75 plus 40.50 plus 23.40 plus 33.18, which results in 140.63. Now let's figure out our total cost. And remember, the number of units for which we need to make this quotation is for 50. So in order to figure out the total cost, we just need to multiply this cost per unit with the number of units. So that is just going to be 140.63 times 50, which results in the total cost to be 7,031.50. Now we require the total selling price, right? And in order to figure out the selling price, we first need to add our total profit to the cost. And this will give the total selling price. Again, we were given additional information that X Limited would require a profit margin of 25% on this work. And profit margin just means the ratio of our profit to the selling price. And this is to be 25%. So that's profit. And we know that the selling price is just the sum of cost and profit, right? And we already have the cost to be 7,031.50 plus profit. And this should be 0.25. So let's multiply this to the other side. That is going to be P equals to 0.25 times 7,031.50 plus P times 0.25. Let's bring this to the other side. That is going to be P minus 0.25P equals to 0.25 times 7,031.50. So P minus 0.25P is going to be 0.75P equals to 0.25 times 7,031.50, which gives our profit to be 0.25 times 7,031.50, divided by 0.75. This results in the amount of total profit to be 2,343.83. Let's write it down. Now, in order to figure out the total selling price, we just need to add these two amounts. That's 7,031.50 plus 2,343.83, which results in 9,375.33. This concludes the sixth part. We can now move towards the seventh one. We need to explain why a business apportions service department costs to production departments. So the reason is, if the service center's costs are not included in our total costs or the total overheads for our production departments, then those costs will not be recovered and the selling price will be incorrect because that cost will not be incorporated while calculating our total selling price, right? Let's write it down. If service centers costs are not included, then the cost will not be recovered and the selling price will be incorrect. This concludes the seventh part. We can now move towards the eighth one. We are given additional information. The directors of X Limited have been advised that they should change from a departmental overhead absorption rate to one factory-wide rate. They are concerned that this may affect the profits of the business. Now we need to advise the directors whether or not they should make this change by justifying our answer. So the very first thing about factory-wide rate is that it would be way easier to calculate as it requires less detailed analysis. Let's write it down. A factory-wide absorption rate would be easier to calculate as it would require less detailed analysis. And while it is easier to calculate, it is also going to be less accurate, as some work would require either more direct labor hours or more machine hours than others. And as a result, this leads to under or over absorption of overheads on each job. Let's write it down. However, it would be less accurate as some work would require either more direct labor hours or more machine hours than others, and as a result, this would lead to under or over absorption of overheads on each job. And we know that if the overheads are overabsorbed, this leads to a higher selling price. Let's write it down. If overheads are overabsorbed, this may lead to a higher selling price, And this higher selling price may cause the demand to drive down, right? Which in turn may lead to lower demand. And if there are lower demands, then it might result in lower profits and consequently lower profits. Let's write down a similar case for underabsorption. If overheads are underabsorbed, this may lead to a lower selling price and if the selling price is lower, then it might mean that the cost would not be covered and consequently failure to cover all production costs, which again results in lower profits. So resulting in lower profits. So either way, whether there may be overabsorption or underabsorption, we can see that it consequently results in lower profits, which is not good for our business. And this happens if we adopt one factory-wide rate, right? And we absolutely do not need lower profits. So in order to avoid this, we now need to advise the directors that they should not be making this change. Let's write it down. So our decision is that the directors should not make the change to a factory-wide absorption rate. Okay, this concludes the 7th part of this question as well as the entire question of 2022 October-November paper 2-3. And if you found this video useful, make sure you like the video and leave a comment below, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you do not miss any of these videos in the future. Thank you.